As you watch this show tonight, there are about 6,000 people in Maine who are homeless, who don't have a reliable roof over their head. There are thousands more who are living in unsafe housing, and almost everyone you know who is looking for an apartment or a house to buy feels like they are priced out of the market. Tonight, we are going to just scratch the surface of the housing crisis in Maine. We will have more episodes to talk about some of the solutions and what else is happening. But tonight, we're going to talk with an advocate on housing policy, a policymaker herself. But we're going to start with the story of Marshall Mercer and talk with him, a man who is formerly unhoused and also formerly incarcerated, about what it is taking in his work to make sure that people can have a roof over their head and get over the obstacles that it takes to try and find a house or a place to live. Because all of us know that a home is the foundation of everything. So please stick with us and join me as we welcome Marshall Mercer. We are so pleased to welcome to the show our friend Marshall Mercer, who is an advocate with the Maine Recovery Advocacy Project and is someone who has actually experienced being unhoused. At the same time, he is someone who is helping other people get housing and is the best, kindest, boots on the ground guy that I know. So Marshall, thanks so much for being with us here at Maine Challenge today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on, Betsy. Yeah, homelessness is really hard, especially for us as Impact out here in recovery. I know for me in a leadership role, when I was up in Machias, I was running a recovery center and I was going through a separation with my wife and nobody even knew about it because I didn't speak on it. And I was homeless for 6 months living in my center, washing myself, cleaning, and it seemed like people knew, but no one wanted to say anything, right? So you're in this place where you want to reach for help, and a lot of us in recovery, we've dealt with shame for so long and been stigmatized that we don't even want to ask for help. And then you deal with marginalized communities, people who've done with racism or who've been hurt with so many things. You get this place sometimes that you're afraid to ask. There's a lot of homelessness, especially in Augusta, Lewiston, Machias, rural areas, and it seems like we forget about them. And
I know.
I stay in the field doing what I do because I could potentially be homeless again. Yeah. I'm out of a job again. I don't got money. I have rent coming up, and I am out there on the street trying to help other people get housing.
And Marshall, can you just describe, if you can, and sort of what a day in the life is like? Like when you don't have the security of housing, it seems like that makes everything else harder. Can you just sort of just give us a window into what it's like?
So think of it like this. When you have all the things that you need, your mentality's sound. So you don't have to think and stress about those things. So when you're homeless and you don't have a job or you got to think about how you can get money to eat, you got to start worrying about those essentials. So we get this thing that happens to us in our brain, fight or flight or freeze. We either get agitated, fight. We might end up doing things because we're so hungry. What are we going to do? We got to eat. Yeah. You're going to steal. What happens if you steal because you're hungry? You end up in jail, and then you're locked up in the system. We all know what happens when we get in the system. What happens to people like us? You can't get out. So it's like survival. So there's so many people out here in the streets right now living in a different world that people don't even understand. And the people that have things, normal society, that forget about those that's been caught up in the invisible line, they don't think about the people that don't have those essential needs: family, love, a car, or someone just to tell them I love you, or
a place to brush your teeth,
place to take a shower so you can come out so you don't stink and clean. I mean, your mentality, you start to go crazy, and then the world's looking at you that way. So it's like you get the symbol put on you, and now you feel that way. Everybody's looking at you that way. So
talk to us a little bit about the additional stigma when you're either formerly incarcerated or you're in recovery, race. What do you find is the biggest challenges when you're trying to help someone? What are the challenges that you find?
That, say if somebody don't have a job, right? So the only choices they have, or someone don't have an identity, they have to go through these steps and these loops and through the system just to be able to get into something. So the only choices is sober housing or some kind of forced living that you have to live just to get your feet in. So if you're a human and you just, for instance, lost your wife and you went through a mental issue and your wife took the house or something like that, or so things, how are you going to get, I guess what I'm saying is it can happen to any average Joe.
Yeah, absolutely.
For any reason at all. It doesn't have to be drugs or anything like that. And then you don't have those things no more. And you don't know how to find these places. And you find people on these streets that it's not necessarily always drugs or that they may have had bad luck.
Yeah.
And I find people on the streets like that all the time. They don't even know how they got here. And it's just they're stuck there and they've got so used to people looking at them at a certain way that they don't even know how to, like they don't feel human no more. What if we helped other people like me become where I am? What would they do for the world? The world is broken and it's going to take us and radical love to fix it.
Absolutely. Radical love indeed, Marshall. It would solve a lot of things. So we're going to now transition from talking about an individual story and what takes on the individual level to what the problem looks like on a more macro level. We are talking with Deb Ibonwa, a housing advocate with the Maine Equal Justice Partners. So, Deb, I know that Maine Equal Justice Partners works on a whole variety of issues, from income equality to labor issues to justice and equity issues. Tell me what's the status of the problem? What's the status of what's going on in housing that has led Maine Equal Justice to decide to work on this as a priority?
Well, I think before the pandemic, we had a housing crisis, but it only got exacerbated with the pandemic to levels. I don't think it's ever been worse in the state of Maine. And root causes that have been existent have just come to the light all of a sudden. And it's become the thing that everybody is talking about, not just in Maine, but everywhere in the nation. And I mean, the stats, I could go through a lot of them, but stuff that sticks to my head is 26% of our homeless population is represented by or is composed of our Black population, who only make up 1.6% of the population. So 26 times as much Black people that actually live here make up the rate of homelessness in Maine, which is way worse than the national, if you do the math nationally and look at the data. So there's that, and we have a shortage of, I believe, around 20 or 25,000 affordable rentals or rental units at all. So there's a lot of people on the street right now, and we know that exacerbates our public health, and it also affects the economy. And it's just something that we need to really be honest about and put our heads together and really just address right now, because it's only going to get worse and worse. And it's not only a social advocacy problem. I see it's also just a logical, economic problem as well for our state. We need to realize that as well. It's a public health issue. It's a racial equity issue. This bill has a statewide committee that would do the same thing. So providing an additional check to local power, not taking away any power, but just creating more of a checks and balances system where you have someone else who is reviewing, was this the right decision? Because clearly what we have in place has not produced any affordable housing statewide. Zoning policies like we have in Maine, exclusionary zoning policies are at their root just a racist tool to keep people of color and a classist to keep people of color and to keep people with lower levels of income outside of certain areas, benefiting certain others from different socioeconomic classes so that they can have better public services, better public schools, and the rest are left in sort of these poorer pockets of the state and never can move anywhere else that they want to live because they can only buy homes and they can't afford to buy homes. They need multifamily housing. Businesses statewide are looking to recruit new employees. And a lot of those people come from the new Mainer population. A lot of those people could be all of these low income people who are stuck in these pockets of the bigger towns. But they're not able to move closer to the business of employment because cannot afford to live there, have no means to be able to stay there because the zones are only single family zoning districts, and they can only afford apartments, or so it's difficult. And the only way for those employers to be able to recruit as many people as they need is to basically provide subsidies to those employees, that like really crazy high subsidies to those employees that they would rather not pay. So it's an economic issue. And I think businesses also are, probably, or many businesses or most businesses are probably also in favor of doing something about these exclusionary zoning codes. I think everyone, even the other side, will acknowledge there's a housing crisis, just like there's climate, there's global, there's an environmental issue we're dealing with worldwide. But I think the problem is that people really need to realize that it's very urgent. I mean, it's very urgent. People are literally on the street. Families are struggling to survive.
Right. And that's it. And so unfortunately, our time has come to a close, but that I think is probably the place we both have to start and end, is that housing, safe housing, affordable housing is the foundation for everything else, literally the housing foundation, but also for economic security, for the ability to work, for healthcare, all of the things that you mentioned, Deb. So
it's a human right. Yeah. It's everything.
We got to get this under control, and now's the perfect time to do it. So thank you so much for the advocacy, and thanks for your help and work on this, and thanks for letting us know exactly what's going on. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for your time.
Awesome.
I appreciate it.
And speaking of figuring it out, we now have the incredibly wonderful opportunity to speak with State Representative Victoria Morales, who is a housing advocate within the legislature and also in her work outside the legislature. She's going to talk to us about what is happening on the policy level in terms of legislation and how we are going to try and tackle this year this housing crisis here in Maine. So, Victoria, we know that housing is a crisis, and it has been for a long time. And I think with the advent of COVID, it just has exacerbated or shown a light on how serious the housing crisis is. And I know you work so hard on this. And I guess my first question is, it seems I think it's way more complicated than people understand. I think people think we'll just get a house or we'll just build a house. And yet it's been such an intractable problem for so long. Can you talk a little bit about why it's so hard to actually address this issue?
Yes, I can talk currently how difficult it is if you want to buy a home. There are, I think, 9, maybe 8 homes for sale currently in Maine right now. So supply. On the renter side, it's very similar. Our vacancy rate is below 1%, which means there just aren't housing units available for folks to rent. When an apartment comes online, there can be anywhere from 15 to 40 applicants for that unit. So it's really tricky for folks. For example, if you look at the Maine housing data, and the website is really, really good and up to date, but our renter household median income right now in Maine is $38,000 approximately, but you need $42,000 to be able to affordably rent a 2-bedroom apartment in Maine and not spend more than a third of your income on rent. And that's really tricky for folks because they are just not making those incomes. And it's similar for folks who want to buy a home, because right now the median income just in general in Maine is around the $60,000 to $63,000. But you need $79,000 to buy the median priced home right now in Maine, which has gone up to $295,000 statewide.
Wow.
So when you have a state that has 41,000 people who are extremely low income, about 80,000 folks who are low income, below and just above the poverty limit, there are just so many people who are struggling.
Yeah. Wow.
The long-term view is, when you look back, and fortunately we have this data because we can go back to the 80s and the 90s, and we can see that in those decades, we built 10,000 units a decade of affordable housing. And had we kept pace with building 10,000 units in the 80s, 10,000 units in the 90s, and at that point we stopped, Had we kept pace with that amount of construction, we would have the supply that we need for folks to be able to move into the homes they either want to rent, and when they're, ready to buy, we would have those units, and we have not. So just for example, in the last decade, we built less than 3,000 units of affordable housing in Maine.
And why is that? Why did it drop off so dramatically?
Well, it's priorities.
There's not one reason, but what are some of the things that contribute to that? Let me say that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's priorities. We did have a sort of a federal movement since the 80s to move away from building public housing and move towards the low-income housing tax credit program, which is the only way that Maine builds affordable housing today. And it's a good process because it involves the entire community, and we are moving towards mixed income, which I always think is a good idea for our communities. We shouldn't isolate and segregate and have, folks who are low income only living in low income segments of the population and higher income. So it's a good model, but we have not prioritized it at the federal level. And in Maine, we only spend traditionally 0.006.3% of our budget on creating new housing units. So that needs to change.
Yeah, do that percentage again.
It's 0.00643% of our state budget is spent on creating housing units.
Wow.
So that's why we're in the situation we are in. We have not prioritized that we need, we need private sector, but we need the government to prioritize that housing is a fundamental need. It's an essential need. It's the foundational sort of Maslow's pyramid of needs. If you do not have housing, you cannot access the benefits of education, of job training, of healthcare, of really anything, of being well and healthy if you don't have a stable and affordable home. And I think now we are realizing that, but how we put that pieces together and make sure we have that funding is my goal as a legislator and as a nonprofit director.
Wow. Okay, so it is not to make a pun, but it's so foundational, right? If you're not safely housed, you can't do anything else. So, okay, so in buckets, if that's the right word, like what are some of the things we need to do? Because again, I think people think, well, we'll just buy a house, just build a house. It's not that easy. So I know that there are things that need to change in lots of areas, and I know you're working on a bunch of them. So can you just give us sort of the buckets of where we need to see real change to make progress?
Yes, absolutely. And one of them that has wide statewide support right now is Speaker Fecto's zoning bill. Okay. And so there is a zoning commission that has been meeting statewide, and it's representatives of both renters and developers, nonprofit, for-profit, local governments, city planners, statewide that have been meeting and came up with recommendations. And some of those are around where do we build the housing? Because we could have all the money in the world that we put forward towards housing. And I say that knowing we're not going to have all the money in the world, but if we had all the money we needed, right? And we put that towards building housing, we still have legal barriers to where we can actually put a shovel in the ground and get a housing project permitted. Okay. We saw recently in Cape Elizabeth, they rejected a housing project. And so there are things like zoning, changes that are going to need to adopt smart growth measures that incentivize density, meaning higher buildings, buildings that have more units, that are closer to amenities, closer to jobs, closer to grocery stores, schools, that have transit, so that folks aren't driving such a long distance, which also intersects with our climate goals. Yeah. So housing and climate, transit kind of all go together, as well as with equity and racial justice. It also includes allowing anyone who owns property to add an accessory dwelling unit on to their property. And so they can use that accessory dwelling unit to, rent to someone in need, but also to pay their own bills. Yeah. And we see this as a great advantage for our rural communities, for our seniors, perhaps living alone, to make it easier and an as of right for folks to, in a way to use their property. And so that's a way that we can create housing without the state actually spending any money on it, to allow private property owners to use their property to create housing if they want. They don't have to, if they choose. So that's an essential bill. Another one is just one that I sponsored is around creating housing vouchers that are Maine vouchers. So currently, we have Section 8 vouchers through the federal government. We have about 12,000 vouchers in Maine that flow through from the federal government. However, there is a 27,000 household waiting list for Section 8 vouchers today in Maine. So what does that tell us? That tells us that we need to invest some of our state dollars in this type of housing assistance for Maine people. Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at the governor's budget and we're seeing that there is some movement towards funding more housing, we want to increase that so that we are actually getting to that 1,000 units a year that we want to build, because today we are at a gap of 20,000 units of housing that we need to meet the need. Mm-hmm. So if we create 1,000 units every year, we need $50 million to do that. That will also include providing the housing vouchers that folks need to afford those units. And so that's why we are focusing very specifically on resourcing Maine housing to create the affordable units we need, up to 1,000 units a year, and then having those 1,000 housing vouchers to support the people who are going to live in those units.
Okay, so supply, you have to have units and the places, and then the money to have people be able to afford those units. So it's really from both ends. And as you said, like it's hard for anybody. And then we have people with special populations, people with mental health issues, substance use disorder, people who are previously incarcerated, who have just another whole set of barriers, right? And as well.
Absolutely. And that's, I'll switch my hat from my legislator hat to my day job hat at Quality Housing Coalition, because that's what we focus on, knowing that it takes 3 to 5 years to build an affordable housing project. Yeah. It just takes time. You have to go through that permitting process, which hopefully Speaker Fecto's bill will hope to decrease the amount of time that folks take to get through that, right? But it does take time. And so what we focus on is we do have available housing units, apartments with private sector landlords. What we need to do is to have housing navigation work that makes that bridge between vulnerable populations who face very difficult barriers in overcoming the application process and the housing sustainability process to be able to stabilize themselves and stay in that housing with those landlords. So what we do is we recruit landlords to join us, rent to folks who have subsidies, who have some barriers. We support each one of those tenants with housing mentors throughout the entire year-long tenancy and beyond. Wow. We provide housing mentor checklists, check-ins with visits to the units, and all kinds of conflict resolution using more of a restorative frame for every time there is a potential lease violation or a lease violation, with the whole goal of successful tenancies for both the landlord and the tenant.
Wow.
So it's a great process, and I'll just share our data, which we just pulled together because we're applying for some grants so we can build capacity. But in 3 years and 4 months of existence, up until the end of 2021, we served 275 households and upwards of 687 adults and children in private sector units, all of whom would have been screened out of the application process. Many of them are asylum seekers. Many of them rely on general assistance, Section 8 vouchers, and all of them had barriers to accessing housing.
Wow, that is incredible, Victoria. The first part was like, oh my God, but that actually gives me hope or us hope. And, it just, I think so much of it is really, as you said, focusing the attention and putting it in the priority list and saying, this is really important. And I think, and again, all the pieces, the sustainability piece, the accessibility to not just housing, but to transportation and jobs. And on the overlay of this, right, I'm hoping that you're feeling optimistic. I'd love to know, because it seems like employers, like with the difficulty of attracting employees, housing is a big part of that now, right?
Absolutely. And we saw that in the Governor's Economic Recovery Committee recommendations, that was one of the top recommendations, that we need housing because employers cannot attract workers, cannot keep workers because they can't find housing either to purchase or to rent or to stay in the housing that they have. Absolutely. It will be a boon to our economy if we are able to invest in housing.
Great. So let me just end with, I know, how optimistic are you? How are you feeling about all of this chance, this like moment in history when we have the crisis illuminated and we have such need by employers and we have money for the first time, right? How optimistic are you feeling?
I am really optimistic that we are going to have more funding than we've ever had that goes towards this problem. The question is how much?
Yes.
And that's what we're working on.